Cassidy Lang had been quiet since childhood. Even before tragedy shaped her world, her silence seemed stitched into her being, like an invisible lining under her skin. When her mother died suddenly in late autumn, Cassidy was uprooted from the only home she had ever known and sent to live with her father in the fog-wrapped coastal town of Camden, Maine. He lived in a tall, narrow house perched precariously on a granite bluff, the kind of house that looked down on the Atlantic Ocean with secrets pressed against its windows. The house smelled of brine and old varnish, and its walls whispered when the wind blew hard enough. Cassidy arrived with a single suitcase and a photo of her mother tucked between her notebooks. Her father greeted her stiffly, almost like an obligation rather than reunion. Within a month, he married a woman named Lynn. Lynn was precise in her movements and expressionless in her affection. She had the kind of face that seemed unchanged by time, and a voice that slid like frost along the skin. She rearranged the furniture on her second day in the house and had Cassidy's belongings moved to the small windowless room beneath the stairs, once used for storing tools and winter coats. It had a thin cot, a bare bulb, and the low rumble of the nearby water heater. Cassidy was told she could personalize it if she wanted, but nothing she added stayed in place for long. From the very beginning, Lynn enforced silence like a law. There was no more piano music. Cassidy's hands were kept idle. Speaking at the dinner table was forbidden. The mere mention of Cassidy's mother caused the air to turn colder. Lynn refused to let her name be said aloud, insisting it brought too much emotional interference into the home. The family photo that once hung above the fireplace disappeared. In its place was a framed painting of sea lilies in winter, pale and brittle. Cassidy's presence in the house was gradually erased from every visible corner. Her toothbrush was kept in a drawer. Her clothes were separated from the main laundry. Her school awards were placed in a cardboard box in the attic, labeled with a black marker, Misk. She became the guest, a title Lynn used not out of politeness, but as a quiet warning. And each time Cassidy tried to assert her place, Lynn's sharp glance or dry remark reminded her that gratitude was expected. Gratitude for being taken in. Gratitude for being clothed, fed, housed, however conditionally. Her father, once warm if distant, grew quieter with each passing week. He stopped looking her in the eye. He deferred to Lynn in all decisions and disappeared most evenings into his study, emerging only to refill his drink or nod absently when Cassidy passed. In that house, Cassidy's voice thinned to a whisper, then dissolved entirely. She moved like a ghost among people who refused to see her, in a home where memory was a threat and silence was a survival tactic. Outside, the sea beat against the rocks, as if trying to remind the cliffs of something they had long buried. Inside, Cassidy folded her pain into routine, folding blankets, washing dishes, finishing homework by flashlight when the hallway light didn't reach. She never cried aloud. The walls would have listened, and Lynn would have smiled. Cassidy spent most of her free hours at the town library, a small red brick building nestled between the post office and a bakery that always smelled of scorched sugar. It was quiet, and the fluorescent lights buzzed just low enough to fade into the background. The shelves at the back held what she truly sought, not the shiny paperbacks with neat endings, but the older volumes, the ones that smelled of damp linen and forgotten intentions. She gravitated toward fairy tales, but not the softened versions. She preferred the ones with wolves who didn't talk, only hunted, and forests that took things instead of giving them back. Stories with blood and ash and salt. Stories of girls who were cast out and returned different. In those books, Cassidy found the outlines of something she couldn't yet name, an architecture of revenge wrapped in metaphor. There was no magic wand, only patience. No happy endings, only consequences. She took notes on small scraps of paper torn from the back pages of abandoned atlases, folded them into tiny squares, and kept them under her mattress at home. In her own notebook, she began to draw. The first maps were crude. just the shape of her bedroom and the hallway. But soon the entire house took shape. Floor by floor, cupboard by cupboard, she charted every creak, every hidden latch, every place the shadows lingered longer than they should. She noted the routines of the woman who ruled the house. Lynn's waking times, her medicine cabinet contents, her coffee habits, the hour she left for her evening walk. Even the direction her eyes tended to drift when she wasn't speaking. Cassidy recorded it all in tight, even handwriting, with the precision of someone who knew the value of patterns. Her father remained distant, slipping further from presence each day. He drank more than before, his evening bourbon becoming a second heartbeat. He sat by the window in the den, eyes glazed over as the lighthouse blinked in and out through the coastal fog. When he spoke, it was mostly to himself, muttering half-sentences that dissolved as quickly as they formed. He had become an echo in a house already full of them. October came cold and early that year, with winds that peeled paint from porch railings and carried salt into every crevice. It was during one of her routine escapes to the basement, ostensibly to fetch laundry detergent, that Cassidy found the box. It had been wedged behind an old wardrobe, hidden beneath mildewed blankets and cracked vinyl albums. Dust coated it like skin. Inside, she discovered the remnants of a life erased. Letters in her mother's slanted handwriting, tied together with a faded green ribbon. A children's manuscript with watercolor sketches, unfinished, the corners soft from age and revisiting. Beneath them, carefully wrapped in layers of linen, was a small glass jar. The label had peeled at the edges, but the ink remained dark. For future winters. The contents were strange. Dried berries, blackened, wrinkled, unfamiliar. A dark red powder that shimmered faintly under the bulb's yellow light. And a folded note, written in her mother's hand, deliberate and spare. Steep under moonlight. Stir into honey. Give to the one who refuses to see. Cassidy read it twice, then again in the dark, memorizing the curve of each word. Her breath slowed. There was no explanation, no instruction beyond those 7 lines. But she understood. Not the how, not yet. But the why. The house had taken something from her. And now, somewhere in the soil of its floorboards, a seed had been planted. From that night on, Cassidy moved differently. Not louder, never louder, but more deliberately. She walked barefoot, testing which parts of the wood groaned less. She counted the seconds it took Lynn to fall asleep, the time between her pills and dreams. She began collecting small glass jars, honey, and ingredients from the woods behind the garden, where the frost curled around branches like teeth. The house around her creaked, warped, and settled, but Cassidy was no longer afraid of it. She had begun to understand what it meant for something to rot from the inside, and how to coax it further. By the time December settled in with its gray skies and biting wind, Cassidy had perfected the mixture. The honey was thick, slow-moving, with a scent that clung to the edges of the air like smoke. It smelled faintly of chamomile, but beneath that sweetness was something metallic and darker, like rust soaked in warmth. Each morning, as Lynn stood in her usual stiff posture at the head of the kitchen table, Cassidy poured the tea, stirred slowly, and added a teaspoon of the honey. It dissolved like a secret. Lynn accepted the cup with the absent nod of someone who had come to expect things without gratitude. She never looked closely. She never noticed the subtle shift in scent or the way the tea's surface shimmered strangely when the light hit it. Cassidy watched her drink with a quiet patience, always seated just far enough away to seem invisible. Soon, the house began to change. The mirrors no longer reflected accurately. They fogged from within, even when the air was cold and dry. Cassidy caught glimpses of shadows that didn't match her movements, saw her own reflection blink when she hadn't. The hall carpet, once tightly fitted and straight, curled at the corners, like it had grown restless. The family photographs on the walls, posed smiles frozen in time, began to lose clarity. Faces faded. Colors bled into each other. Eventually, the images looked like bruises pressed beneath glass. Lynn's habits grew more erratic. She spoke to no one, but seemed always mid-conversation. At night, Cassidy heard her pacing from room to room, muttering fragments of sentences as if answering voices only she could hear. She tore at the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, stripping it away with shaking hands and leaving behind long, raw veins of plaster. She stopped sleeping in the bedroom, preferring instead to curl up on the floor beneath the living room windows, wrapped in throw blankets like a warning. Cassidy offered kindness in measured doses. She warmed milk and brought it in delicate porcelain cups. She brushed Lynn's hair in silence, slow, rhythmic strokes that made the woman flinch, though she never said why. When the house grew too quiet, Cassidy would open an old book, one her mother had read long ago, and whisper stories aloud. The language was ancient, her voice soft, almost melodic, echoing faintly off the peeling walls. Lynn never asked where the tales came from. She simply lay still, her eyes open too wide, listening as if each word carved something deeper into her bones. With each passing day, Lynn seemed to shrink. Her skin grew pale, translucent at the edges, as if the light had given up on her. Her hands trembled when she reached for anything, and her movements became hesitant, like she no longer trusted the floor beneath her. Cassidy watched with a clinical stillness, never rushing, never celebrating. This wasn't vengeance. It was erosion, a slow return of balance. Outside, the snow began to fall in thin, slanting sheets, covering the world in quiet. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of honey and something else beneath it, something deeper, something that pulsed between the walls and the wires. Lynn drifted through it like a woman halfway between sleep and waking. Cassidy, always attentive, made sure the tea was warm. She made sure the room stayed dim. She made sure the story never ended. By Christmas Eve, the house stood in near silence, muffled under snow and something heavier. Cassidy had spent the afternoon in the kitchen, alone, except for the ticking of the old clock and the occasional creak of the ceiling above. She moved methodically, sifting flour, slicing apples with precision, measuring honey from the same jar she had guarded for months. From a hidden tin in the back of the cupboard, she took out the final piece of dried berry, the last remnant from the jar marked for future winters. It was brittle, nearly black, with a sharp resinous scent that lingered in her fingertips long after she ground it into powder. The pie came out golden and fragrant, laced with cinnamon, cloves, and something else that didn't have a name. Cassidy let it cool as snow began to fall again, slow and silent, blanketing the windows in white. She placed a single slice on fine china, laid it carefully on a silver tray beside a matching fork and knife, and walked up the stairs. Her steps made no sound. Lynn had barely left her room for days. The air inside was stale, thick with uneaten food and closed blinds. Cassidy entered without knocking and placed the tray on the bedside table. The pie glistened under the dim lamplight. Lynn sat upright, eyes glassy, as if pulled from some internal tide. She reached for the fork slowly, like her hand no longer belonged to her. Bite by bite, she ate in silence. Cassidy stood beside her, watching as the woman's gaze drifted toward the glass of water on the nightstand. She stared at her reflection in its surface for a long time, her expression tightening as if what she saw no longer followed the rules of mirrors. That night, Cassidy returned to her room and waited. The storm outside grew louder, but inside the house, the noise came from elsewhere. Lynn began speaking in low, frantic bursts, pacing the length of her bedroom with uneven steps. She muttered about the smell of apples in the walls, about the photographs on the landing blinking when no one was watching. Her voice rose and fell in waves. Cassidy remained in bed, eyes closed, listening. By morning, Lynn hadn't slept. Her face was gaunt, pale beneath the hollows of her eyes, her hands trembling as she clawed at the window panes. She whispered that the walls were whispering back, repeating her own words in a voice that wasn't hers. She claimed to hear laughter echoing through the floorboards, laughter too small, too familiar, and not entirely human. On the second night, Cassidy found torn pages scattered in the hallway, pieces of Lynn's diary scribbled over with black ink. The wallpaper was stripped from the guest room, leaving only claw marks and raw plaster. Lynn had taken to dragging furniture against the door, as if trying to keep something out. Or in. The lights began to flicker without reason. Shadows moved in unnatural directions. Cassidy walked past them untouched. By the third night, the house sank into total darkness. The electricity cut out with a single crack, followed by silence so deep it felt alive. The windows frosted from within. Lynn screamed once, briefly, then fell quiet. Cassidy didn't go to her. She remained seated on the staircase, watching the dark pool through the slats of the railing, her breath slow and even. By morning, the bed was empty. The sheets had been folded back. The clothes in the closet were gone. No toothbrush in the bathroom, no shoes by the door, no scent in the air. Even her name had vanished from the papers in the study drawer. Cassidy checked the linen closet and found her mother's name penciled faintly on the inside of the door, but nothing else remained. It was as if Lynn had never existed. Not in the house, not in the records, not in memory. Her presence had been peeled away like old wallpaper, stripped until there was only wood and silence. The house did not mourn. It creaked once and settled. Cassidy went downstairs and washed the empty pie dish under cold water. The crumbs disappeared into the drain. Behind her, the dining room clock began to tick again. Her father began to emerge slowly from the haze he had lived in for so long, as if a curtain had been lifted from the rooms of his mind. He wandered through the house with uncertainty, calling out for Lynn with growing confusion. He searched drawers and closets, flipped through mail, and checked voicemail messages that were all blank. He paced the driveway and questioned the neighbors, but each conversation ended in bewilderment. They claimed they had never seen a woman named Lynn. One elderly neighbor insisted he had always lived next to a widower and his quiet daughter. The police officer who came by the house jotted down a missing person report out of formality, but found nothing in the system. No driver's license, no medical records, no employment history. The name returned no matches. Inside the house, the walls began to still. The strange creaks faded into normal quiet. The photos in the hallway regained their clarity. But where Lynn had once appeared, at family dinners, on the front porch, standing stiffly at holidays, her face had turned blank. The frames remained, the bodies beside her remained, but her image had dissolved. In every picture, there was now only a pale void where her head had been, as if the film had been scratched away or had never held her at all. Cassidy moved into the upstairs bedroom without ceremony. It had once belonged to her mother, and briefly to Lynn, but now it belonged to her. The room had slanted ceilings, 2 windows facing the sea, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar and salt. She hung new curtains, soft linen in a muted pattern, and repainted the trim in a shade of bone white. She moved her books to the windowsill and tucked her old notebooks beneath the bed. Her father didn't question the change. He called her sweetheart again, like he had when she was small. Sometimes he looked at her with watery eyes and whispered apologies for things he couldn't name. He grew gentler, quieter. He spent most afternoons sitting in the den, reading aloud from old novels or staring out toward the shore. The bottle of bourbon on his desk remained unopened. At night, he went to bed early and left his door ajar, as if needing reassurance that he wasn't alone. The house adapted to its new rhythm. The floors felt warmer underfoot. The draft beneath the kitchen door no longer howled. The pantry was stocked with tea and spices. Cassidy kept the honey in a different jar now, plain and amber-colored, placed beside the window where the light could touch it. Still, there were reminders. At night, when the house fell into stillness, the air in Cassidy's room would fill with a familiar scent. The honey, sharp and herbal, with a trace of metal beneath the sweetness. It lingered around her pillow, in the folds of her blanket, in the corners of the wardrobe. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she heard her mother's voice humming softly from the basement below. The same melody that had once lulled her to sleep when storms clawed at the windows. In the cellar, a single glass jar remained on the high shelf behind the boiler. The label had faded almost entirely, but the word at the center still held, used. The lid was sealed tight, the contents long gone. Dust gathered around it like ash. Cassidy didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The house already knew who it belonged to. 1 year later, Cassidy graduated from high school. The ceremony was small and quiet, just as she preferred, held in a brick auditorium filled with folding chairs and the smell of auditorium dust. Her father attended, sitting alone near the back, clapping politely at her name, tears in his eyes. That summer, she packed her belongings into 2 suitcases and a canvas bag of books. In late August, she left for college in Massachusetts, leaving behind the sea, the salt, and the house that had become something more than home. The house remained standing on the edge of the bluff, its white paint weathered by wind and time, its windows reflecting only what they wanted to. It stood empty, but not abandoned. A kettle still rested on the stove, rust beginning to gather along its spout. In the kitchen, a radio sat on the shelf above the pantry, its antenna slightly bent, tuned always to a frequency just beneath clarity. At night, when fog curled up from the sea like breath, a voice could be heard from its speaker, a woman's whisper, just on the edge of recognition, threading words through static. The locals spoke in hushed tones about what lingered on that stretch of coast. Some swore they saw a girl walking the cliffs when the moon was low, her hair pale as frost, her dress made of something that shifted like mist. She never looked directly at anyone, but she always seemed to know who was watching. She carried a small thermos in her hand, and sometimes, when the wind was right, they said they could smell honey and herbs drifting on the air. Stories began to collect like salt on the rocks. Children whispered about a house where doors closed by themselves and walls wept if someone lied inside them. Older residents warned newcomers not to walk too close to the edge, not to answer when someone called their name from the fog. The legend took shape slowly, like moss growing over stone. They said the girl offered tea to those who had cast others aside. Tea that tasted sweet, but left the tongue numb. Tea that made you remember things you'd buried too deep. Some said she was kindness returned in another form. Others said she was the price of forgetting. There were variations, of course. Some claimed she was a spirit. Some swore she was only a myth told to frighten cruel parents. But one truth settled across all the versions. She had once been cast out, and now she had returned. Not in rage, not in grief, but in silence and with purpose. They said the house no longer belonged to any one family, that it answered now only to her, that the floorboards carried her footsteps even when no one was home, that the cellar door would not open unless she allowed it, and that the walls, once witnesses to forgetting, now remembered everything. In that quiet corner of the country, where fog swallowed the sun and legends moved through the woods like wind, one house remained a warning. Here, the stories did not end with weddings or with laughter. They ended with a return, and with reckoning.